Hi, everyone. This is Laura Campagna, the Wednesday Witch, and I am here with my dear friend, therapist, teacher, Maura McDonald-Brown, and we are going to be talking about Chiron and the archetype of the wounded healer today. So, Mara is a really insightful therapist, and one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation is because there is a lot in the collective right now that is up for healing. And a lot of my clients in astrology, and I also practice energy healing, are engaging with the myth and the archetype of Chiron and have been asking me questions, and it's been coming up in readings very frequently. And I have found that as an astrologer and as someone with a background in feminist counseling and social justice engagement, that I have really benefited from having conversations with my friends and folks in my community who are professionals. I didn't train as a therapist, even though astrology has a lot of counseling aspects. And I just think that whenever we talk, there's so much overlap between our work, between the themes we're exploring. And I know you're a really fabulous teacher. You are an adjunct professor at Simmons School of Social Work. So I'm really excited to engage in this conversation and offer this to folks in our community today.
Me too. That was a great introduction. I also just wanted to name that I'm trying to drink more water, and I saw recently that Lizzo's trying to drink a gallon of water a day. So there'll be times when I'm going on mute, and that's what I'll be doing. But thank you for the really lovely introduction. I don't know that I have more to add at this point, but I totally agree with you that there's so much overlap, and I think that there are so many different times where I wish I could bring in more perspectives and just kind of the traditional route of psychology that we're taught. And sometimes I do, depending on the client. There's a big debate going on about whether or not that's appropriate within the more up and coming generations and like on Instagram, which we won't get into today, but maybe in the future we'll dabble in a bit. But I do think that anything that can provide some insight and acceptance around people's journeys as humans is beneficial. So, and I learned so much from talking to you, and I bring it up almost every chance I can get in a non-professional sphere, and increasingly in professional spheres as well.
Thanks. And I just wanted to say that, I'm thinking of the fact that there's a lot of astrologers who trained as therapists or psychotherapists, or that's like an amazing water bottle that you have. That's really gonna, I think, help you meet that gallon mark.
I'm totally a different person already.
Yeah, totally. You're peeing all the time. And there's a lot of folks who are counselors already, have that training and then get into astrology, or that develops concurrently in their life. And then there's folks like me who have a background, and I did social justice organizing for 10 years, and then I taught. And so while there were therapeutic aspects to the work that I did before astrology, this is the most kind of clearly and obviously counseling based profession I've engaged with consistently, and I've been doing it for 5 years. And so I think that I rely on my friends who are therapists and counselors to give me some insight. And so I'm hoping that this will be helpful for other astrologers like me, who don't have that background and want to learn more, and who also learn really well from like hearing about experts in the field. And I'm also hoping this will be helpful and interesting to therapists and counselors who are interested in astrology and divination and magic and all of the things that kind of surround the healing profession, but that haven't traditionally been included in the canon in academic settings. So
Yeah, I love that. I want to add just one quick thing, which is that I think like, you know, both in clinical work, which is like the one-on-one and or group, but the more like therapeutic aspects of mental health counseling and social work, and then and especially in the teaching of social work, I think that, that saying that is, you can't teach someone what they don't already know.
Mm,
I think that's really true, because I think that if you're drawn to any of the healing arts, which I know is a thing, but also reminds me of Harry Potter, then I feel like you are, a healer, and you're gonna be like dabbling in anything that works for you. So I think that I really appreciate the way you articulated that as like the ways in which we can all learn from each other. But I also think there's a sense of knowing the truth of all of these different approaches if you have some sort of curiosity about it. Does that make sense?
yeah, absolutely. And that's actually a great segue into talking about the archetype of the wounded healer, Chiron. So I first actually came to be exposed to this concept in my first astrology reading I ever received, because in my chart there's a grand earth trine between Saturn, who's the ruler of my sun, my Venus, and Chiron. And so I was describing to the astrologer some situations in my life or issues that were up for me, and she just like went right into the myth of Chiron. And when you start to cry and you don't want to, I mean, that's like a constant for me.
No, that's never happened to me.
Yeah, yeah. As water moons, as people with moons in the first house, yeah, we, I think, relate across that. But I I just felt like I was being told the story of my life in a way that allowed me to view it, to both be seen and witnessed and validated, but also to see it differently. It offered me a
Mm,
different perspective. And I'm really interested in that kind of both validation and pivot that astrology can offer as a healing art. So just for those who are not familiar, in mythology, Chiron was a centaur, the wisest and gentlest of all the centaurs. And centaurs are half human, half beast, horse, and man traditionally. And, you know, centaurs have this reputation of being kind of like rowdy and party animals and making trouble. But Chiron was born the child of Kronos, who is also known as Saturn, and a nymph, Philyra, I think I'm saying it right. But and they are not, they were in horse form when Chiron was conceived, but they are not horses, and they're not centaurs. And so when Chiron came out as a centaur, um he was rejected by his mom and like abandoned by his dad and left to die, as so many kids are in these stories. We see over and over and over again with healing, with myths about healers, with myths about people who become magicians and who engage with magic and all of that. There is some sort of loss around parents, which is like such a
mm.
core, stability. It's such a root chakra kind of wounding. And it's so primal and it's so difficult to heal. And but Chiron was saved and was rescued and was essentially like adopted by Apollo, who is the sun, and Artemis, his sister, who's the moon, and taught all of these healing arts and became a teacher for many youth who then went on to be great Greek philosophers and thinkers. So you have this kind of, immediately you have these dynamics of there's a core wounding and a rejection of one's parents for being a disappointment, for being other than you're supposed to be, for being hideous in their eyes, you know, just for your own form. And I think that as, you know, queer people, that's a very instinctually relatable experience. I think that, you know, happily many youth are growing up in a world where their parents might not be immediately disappointed and have a experience of revulsion upon learning their kids' sexuality, because heterosexuality is still usually assumed. We still live under a compulsory heterosexuality, but for so many queer people, that is just like a really, really relatable experience of like, I'm horrible to you and my very being is like unacceptable, and I might literally be cast out into the wilderness because of that. And but the beauty there is then that like the foster parents come in and offer something wonderful, and helped Chiron to develop in all of these ways that he became a great teacher of other youth. So, and we also see that really strongly in the queer community, where often, you know, we have these definitely when I was coming out and coming up in the 90s, there was like this idea of like, you leave your family and you find your people and you go to like a big city like New York or San Francisco, and you know, you find your community and there's elders there and they teach you how to survive, they teach you the ways, they like bring you up, and then you do that for like the next generation of kids who come through. So this is, to me, an extremely relatable myth on a queer level, and for queer folks. And then you know, Chiron gets injured in a battle through no fault of his own, and shot by an arrow, a poisoned arrow of Hercules that was poisoned with the blood of the Hydra. And you know, having a background in feminist mythology and gender studies, whenever we have a kind of like strong male who has some sort of magic that's connected to having like slayed a snake or like a mythological beast of the underworld, there's usually a referencing of the fact that matriarchal religions and like goddess worshiping was a thing for thousands of years on Earth, and then it was suppressed, and it was violently you know, just with the intention of destroying it, suppressed. So we have this little nod in this reference to what I consider like one of the core wounds of our society, which is patriarchy. And you know, obviously we're both in the United States, we both grew up in Boston area, like white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, you know, all of that, like we have to look at the bigger picture. But with this myth, we're like seeing, okay, so Chiron is wounded by this poison arrow that would have killed a mortal, but because he's a demigod, he can't die. And in some of the myths, he suffers for almost 1,000 years. He is in agonizing pain.
I can relate.
Yeah, totally. I actually thought you might say that. For 1,000 years.
Never ends.
Yeah.
Never ends.
That's how it feels. It's how long our lives feel.
Oh, yeah.
And but you know, that wound is it drives him. It really like it drives him towards this like greater commitment engagement around healing. And so what I was told when I was taught this myth, when this like astrologer was reading my chart and telling me the story, is like the thing about where we find Chiron in the chart is like that's a place where you have a wound that you will never heal. And you have to learn, you have to learn to live with it. But that wound will, through engaging with it, will lead you along towards the path of your destiny. And like that was a lot for me in my 20s. You know, I was kind of not excited about that. But that that's a bit of the background of Chiron. We can kind of like get into, we'll unpack our own stories around our experiences with healing and the archetype of the wounded healer. But the last part I'll just say is that Chiron ultimately begged to be made mortal so he could die. You know, he was like, I
Oh,
suffered
wow.
with this pain for so long and I just
Right.
want to be out of my misery. And I think that's really intense when folks are like, this is too much and I gotta
Mm-hmm.
go.
Mm-hmm.
And he ultimately swapped places with Prometheus, which is like another really powerful myth that we won't get into right now. um but you know, took Prometheus's place in who was being tortured by Zeus essentially, and was allowed to die, was like released from the bondage of pain. Yeah, swapped places with Prometheus in the underworld. So we have there this like kind of like your pain as the teacher that allows you to be of service to other people, and then making the ultimate sacrifice of like giving your life so that someone else can be freed.
Mm.
So Chiron is, it's a deep and it's an intense myth. And I think that for those of us who like have prominent Chiron places in our chart, will often be experiencing elements and aspects of this myth. And it, in my personal experience, it evolves over time where I've lived out more of it now than I had when I was just like kind of engaging with it from a familial standpoint. But that is some of the background, and there's like a lot of really good books about it that I can kind of include in the notes on this. But yeah, so that is the mythology of Chiron, the archetype of the wounded healer.
Okay, I have one response and then I have a question, which
Mhm,
I think might be helpful for folks who are newer to astrology.
mhm.
Um, so first, I didn't know all that about Chiron's parents. I knew that Chiron was a wounded healer, and I thought the wound came from the battle, which is why you should do more than like a perfunctory Google search um, on any of these things.
Sure.
Um, but that makes it even like more potent and brilliant, I think, in terms of just how relatable that is. Um, because so my background is in early childhood mental health, which is a really important part of our lives that I think is increasingly getting more and more attention to, like vis-a-vis funding from our government. But I think typically, unless you have some sort of instincts around kids or work with kids, was a time in our lives where we were pretty much overlooked. And there's so much important stuff happening then, developmentally and from an attachment perspective, and just also how we come to understand the world, which is articulated so well in that Chiron myth. And you know, there's a lot of different theorists that we could bring in the psychology field that talk about this, but I think the probably the person who describes it on such a universal way is Eric Erickson, who talks about the first couple of years of an infant, like your primary task is to either develop trust or mistrust. And so if you don't develop a trust that like your primary caregiver will respond to you, that you will get your dirty diaper changed, that you will get your you will get fed regularly, that if you cry, someone will comfort you in a way that feels safe and validating and accepting of who you are, um, then those relationships act as a hint of what the larger world is like. And so if you have this consistency, you start to develop a trust that like my needs are met, I'm here, I'm supposed to be here, people want me here. And if they aren't, then you start to think, much like Chiron's experience, like I'm not lovable, I'm not meant to be here, people don't want me here, my needs aren't important, my needs won't be met. And this all happens at a pre-verbal moment. And so these become just a part of your story of yourself that is very emotional, very much kind of rooted into your understanding of the world, but you don't know until much later, and you see an astrologer, or you sit through years of therapy, or you do any other sort of
Yeah.
healing, that is separate from your actual being.
Mhm.
Or you can not know that. I mean, certainly, as you've pointed out, there are many other ways to seek understanding and healing that we have access to. But I think a big sort of like mortal injury, bum, of that age is really feeling like your needs aren't going to be met, and understanding that to be, I don't belong here, and I'm not loved. And that is sort of the narrative that we can carry with us on like a cellular level.
Mhm.
Um, and Erickson goes into a lot of other stuff that I think is really interesting. Attachment theory is huge here, but I just wanted to respond because I was making that connection in my head when you were talking about Chiron. Um, and wondering, for people who are newer to astrology, like where would they find Chiron in their chart? Would they schedule like a reading with someone? Could
Yeah.
they just look
Yeah,
it up?
or if you're like, if you're looking up your chart on astro.com, you just like make sure that you select the little Chiron. It's a key. It's the key to unlocking your spiritual potential. But yeah, it's often included now, but it's a little key. So
Cool.
yeah, contact your local astrologer, look on your app, make sure it's checked. Yeah. Do you want to share some of your own personal experience with that myth and that like archetype, that concept?
Yeah, sure. So, I don't know, you and I are doing this for the first time, and I think that like we'll evolve into what this is going to be. And at least for me, I'm not totally sure like how much I'm going to divulge right now.
Hmm.
But I also think that like we talk about this in social work school, of just kind of naming like why you're here and what your purpose is, and how that changes on a regular basis. I think like year to year, or even month to month, if you ask someone what their what brought them here to this healing journey, it's going to change, and that probably has a lot to do actually with what's going on in their chart at the moment.
Yeah.
And what's coming up for them. But I would say that I grew up in an alcoholic household. Um, and for whatever reason, maybe being like a Cancer moon and a Cancer rising, I was just a very emotional person. And I don't think I'll get into like too much of the specifics of my home at the moment, but I can talk about just a general sort of.
I think just share whatever you feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, totally. I usually just like to lay out all of my insecurities right off the bat, so people like during trainings or during a class or now, so that people know what they're dealing with.
As a Cancer moon, it makes you feel more secure to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. Take it or leave it, my friends.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, fast forward this part. Um, so yeah, so I just felt like in my household, um, there wasn't a whole lot of room for emotion, and there wasn't a whole lot of space for having a hard time, or really just like mess. There just wasn't a lot of room for mess. Um, and I also felt like I was walking on eggshells a lot. And I think that I didn't understand any of that really until much later in life, because, like I just mentioned, when you're younger, you don't have a sense that your experience isn't the experience or the reality. You sort of think that what is true for you is just true. So me kind of understanding um, that like I wasn't really allowed or accepted or kind of loved as this kind of messy, really emotional, dramatic little kid, was not something I was like unpacking until much later. But that was sort of the vibe. That was the vibe of the house. And then my dad died when I was 12. And I think that that coincided with a lot of things. Like that coincided with me getting my period for the first time. That coincided with me leaving my Catholic school and going to a public school that was huge very competitive for the first time. And I had a really difficult time in high school for a lot of different reasons. I had undiagnosed ADHD, I was depressed, I kind of was flailing. And I didn't have like really a guiding post or a lighthouse to find my way. I mean, I think I had a lot of really good friends who were um, as helpful as other 13-year-olds who are like navigating existential crisis, who mostly come from alcoholic homes, can be. um, but around that time, my mom bought that book, Reviving Ophelia. Do you remember that
Oh,
book?
I do.
Oh
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
It
Uh-huh.
was like a sentinel. It was like a Paramount book in for our generation. So she bought that book like I think because she wanted to understand how to like help me. I don't think she ever read it, but I took it from her nightstand and I read it. And for folks who don't know, it was written by Mary Pfeiffer, who was a PhD who worked with teenage girls. And everything she talked about was, I mean, just gave me such a perspective and insight and voice to, first of all, understanding that like what I was feeling was pretty normal,
Mhm.
but also giving a context and content for why I might be feeling this way. And it was like that truly was such a gift. And that I had a narrative of my life that wasn't solely placing the blame of my failures on me and on what I wasn't able to do, which is how I had at least felt it was going.
Mhm.
And I mean that was pretty true. Um, so anyway, fast forward, I think I just fell in love with psychology at that moment as sort of a means to understand compassionately what like a human struggle is,
Mhm.
because there was an invitation to understand that um, my struggles were not very different from all these other teenage women that Mary Pfeiffer had seen.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't know. I mean, I think one thing I wanted to say that occurred to me just now, which I think is increasingly part of like our journey together, is that I, for a long time, like didn't understand or couldn't always connect or find within each other the real focus on like individual healing and the focus on like community accountability or like changing systems. Um, and what I'm really appreciating now at this point in like both my kind of like wellness or healing journey on an individual level, but also kind of like as a professional, I think just where we are um, as a country is that like, there's no way of showing up for systems change without doing the personal journey at the same time.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that that's radical to me in a really exciting way. Like not radical in the
Yeah.
way of like that's crazy. You know, I think some people use radical in a negative way, but I think like radical, like the way that Angela Davis talks about it, like being at the root, like that's what the root of so
Mhm.
much of this is,
Mhm.
um, is is coming to find our own love and acceptance, and then like approaching the world in this way of like, could we all understand ourselves differently, and could we understand our other folks in community differently? Um, so I don't know. I mean, I think now,
That's great.
yeah, I think there's so many people talk about that. Like Resmaa Menakem talks about that. He wrote My Grandmother's Hands about racialized trauma, and Adrienne Marie Brown talks about that. There's so many other people, but I think now, I think you know, I'm in recovery. I've been in recovery for several years. I don't know that like my journey of healing or understanding of what I needed really uh, took on the depth um, and power until that happened. Which is not to say, you know, that I wouldn't have found it. Well, I don't know if I would have found it any other way, but I think recovery, being in recovery and being in a 12-step fellowship has been a huge part of where I am now. And I've gone to therapy for a long time, and I'm on antidepressants. But I think like being in community with others who are coming to understand real radical truth about themselves in a way that is like loving and compassionate and has the real power to change our relationship with ourselves has been the most powerful healing thing.
Yeah, oh, I love that. Thank you so much. And I really resonated with when you were talking about that moment where, you read this book and it told your story, but it gave you perspective on it that you didn't have before. And, that experience of the power of storytelling, the power of myth, the human very core need to be witnessed and seen and understood for who you authentically feel yourself to be, and also to understand your struggles in a larger context, that perhaps there is something more going on other than just like, this is really, really hard. And I don't know if I'm going to get through it. And I don't know how
Mm,
long it will last, because it can go on for so long.
a
Um,
thousand years.
yeah, 1,000 years. And, I really identify with my own, healing journey was that from a pretty young age, I struggled with an eating disorder and just really had this core sense of being defective. Like there's something wrong
Mm,
with me. I have this, I'm too sensitive, similar to you. I'm a water moon. I'm a double. Yeah, I'm a double Scorpio. And so I just felt so incredibly connected to the world in a way that felt overwhelming, in a way that made things like too loud, too bright, too intense.
mm,
And I felt everything in my body. I felt other people's feelings in my body. I felt my feelings as if they were waves that crashed over me. And, some of that has changed, some of that hasn't.
mm-hmm.
And I was always told that I was too emotional and that I was too much. I had too many needs.
Mm-hmm.
I was too loud. I was just, yeah, kind of like this little force barreling through the world that didn't feel like it was, that on some core fundamental level was broken. And
Yeah.
I got that messaging really young, through people that loved me and wanted me to be okay, but like,
Right.
that I was told I was not okay the way that I was, and I
Right.
wasn't like, you know, supported in being the way I was, or told it was an okay way to be. And I think that, I I got really interested in I loved books and I escaped into books, and I got really interested in storytelling, and I wanted to be a writer. And I also really cared about social justice from a young age. And I ultimately, went into doing activism professionally. I had intended to go to school undergrad to study creative writing because I really saw that the power of stories to validate who we are in the world and give us a sense of belonging in the world was crucial to people's survival, because like part of what helped me get through high school was just reading memoir and
Mm,
reading the memoirs of folks who had gone through really incredible difficulty, um like Malcolm X, and just all of these writers, and especially from Black literature, who I was just like, people have really struggled and their stories are helping other people. But when I started to go into social justice activism, what I found was that it was really, really hard to like care and show up in the world and really want to see things change, and to be kind of on the front lines of like campaigns and protests and all of these different things. And I didn't have any tools to like
Mhm.
deal with the fact that like that work is hard and it will you'll sustain your own kind of trauma doing it. And
Mhm.
um I lived in New York during 9/11, and I ended up moving to Portland, Oregon to actually like kind of try to heal. And I didn't know, but I was going through Chiron had entered Capricorn, which is the house of my the sign of my Venus and my sun. And Chiron was like exactly like within 2 degrees of my sun when I moved to Portland, and I started studying herbal medicine with this Wicca high priestess. And I had been interested in magic and all of these different things and studying with other folks before that. But that was a real turning point for me. And everyone started saying, like, you really like all this stuff. You're really interested in healing. Like, why don't you just like go be a healer? Why don't you like open an apothecary or something? And I was like, I can't be a healer. Like, I'm a messed up person. Like, I'm a
Yeah.
broken person. I have a
Right, right.
core. I have like a problem at my core that I don't know how to fix. And I can't help anyone until I help myself. And I think that what's really amazing about the myth of Chiron is that it validates that narrative, but it also changes it, right? It shifts our perspective on it, because I then moved to San Francisco and had that same astrologer who's really amazing tell me, you could be an astrologer, but you need to stop drinking, basically. And I had no interest in any of that. I didn't think that I had anything to offer. I
Mm.
was like, I like astrology, I'm into it, obviously, but you know, I didn't think that I had evolved enough on my own journey to be of service or be of use, or the title healer, and especially in the way that healing and wellness has become like an industry that
Totally.
supports like white supremacist culture and all of these patriarchal beauty standards and capitalism just making billions off people's desire to not feel like so
Mhm.
in pain and broken.
Yep.
I was just like, I'm a fat queer person. Like I've got I can't help anybody, but actually, what the mythology of Chiron offers is like, you don't have to go towards your wounds. Like, this is what I've seen and this is what I believe. Like, I didn't actually start engaging with the stuff that she was talking about for almost a decade, really. But
Mm.
as soon as I did, everything in my life changed. And that's the other thing that we see with Chiron, is that there's usually some sort of initiation process where people are put in a situation that is really traumatic, or that takes away the usual supports from their life, and they are in some sort of isolation or seclusion, or it exacerbates feelings of being alone, being unloved, being unwanted, like all those things that you talked about with early childhood attachment. Um and 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 through that process, they become they become desperate enough to seek something else. And it's in that seeking that they come to connect with divinity, in their own experience of divinity. And they come to go towards things that lead them towards their destiny on their own path
Yeah.
of development. So I know for me, I started reading charts just because I was going through the breakup of a long-term committed partnership, and so were a bunch of other my friends. And so I was like seeing it in my chart and like thinking about it all the time, and like then I was looking at it in my friends' charts, and then I just started, I had like an organic practice that emerged from me just like being interested in doing this work, but it was part of an overall initiation process where a life that I had built and created for myself was destroyed. And that was actually like the beginning, the portal and the gateway to this whole healing journey, that has been so incredibly enriching. But I'm really interested in healing that addresses these systemic roots of oppression that is causing so much pain for folks in society along the lines of race and class and gender and sexuality and yeah, ability and all of the different things, and all the different ways that people are marginalized in our society. And in in this idea, breaking down this idea that like to be a healer, you have to be finished, because we're never done.
Right.
Like there's no like, okay, check the box, like completion of the healing journey. Like if you have been engaging in something for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, like however long, you have something to offer someone else who is just starting. And so I
Mm.
think that like I'm interested in healing modalities that are both, you know, informed by an intersectional anti-racist feminist analysis, but also that empower people to feel like they have agency in their life, even if it's just how they witness their own process, or how they come to understand their own story, or the
Yeah.
perspective that it offers, just like the possibility of something else.
Yeah. God, you said so much. I think it's so funny because when you were talking about not feeling like you could be a healer because you were so messed up, I was thinking, and then right before you said the next thing you said, I had this image in my mind when I used to go to yoga um, at a gym that my mom went to in the part of Boston I grew up in. So it was me and all my mom's friends. There was this one instructor who just looked like she like floated down from heaven. You know, she was like beautiful and slim and blonde. And I thought that's what a healer was. Like I was like, I can never be someone that, I think at that time I was like, maybe I'll do my yoga certificate. Um, but I was like, I can't because like she's perfect and I'm not. And I actually think she was a great yoga teacher and you can be like conventionally attractive and be a healer. Um, but I think the messaging, especially right now with the increasingly with the kind of billion-dollar wellness industry, is that you do have to look a certain way, or it really helps anyway. Um, and it's funny because, um, hearing about your journey, I think that um, you had so much insight and so much understanding of yourself in a way that I didn't. Like, I think that's cool that we can talk about that because I think there's probably people who really got it at a young age that like understood their pain and their struggles. And even if you didn't have the language or the perspective that like that was something you carry, that wasn't who you are. I really thought like my life was really good. Like, I really thought that, like, I mean, I was, like, depressed and I had, like, a drinking problem and, I couldn't really maintain friendships very well in the sense that, like, I was always getting to fights with people, um, and, was not really showing up to my life at all, but, like, I thought that my sort of healing potential rested in the fact that like my life was so good. And most of that, I mean, that was like 100% just privilege, right? Because I think like on an individual relationship level, like objectively, like the narrator would come in and be like, her life was not good, like there was not a lot of um thriving happening. But when I like when I started to work at a residential home before I went to get my master's in social work, I really thought that like the proximity to privilege would be enough. Like I really thought that like if I came in and was just like had a lot of positivity and really showed up like with as much energy and love each day, and that I could connect these teenage girls who had um, not a lot in terms of resources, both, you know, tools, but also just financial and economic power, um, then that would be helpful to them. And I think that's such that was it was working in that residential home that I was like, this isn't enough.
Mhm.
What I understand about what is a good life isn't enough. What I understand about helping these girls isn't enough. Um, and going back to them deciding to go to grad school, coming out of there feeling like, okay, I have all the tools now, like this is enough. And then going into work with in a community mental health center, with populations that, you know, largely their mental health is related completely to oppression, you know, and to not having enough resources, and to um, years and years and years of intergenerational trauma, and understanding again, like this isn't enough. Like what I know and what I can bring to the situation, like my proximity to like an education of understanding psychology and understanding racism and understanding trauma, like that's not enough. Um, and I think that now, like having gone through um, my own recovery journey and now working in the addiction and recovery field, coming to understand that like what I do on a daily basis is never going to be enough ever. And at the exact same time, it's always going to be enough because it's all we can do on any given day, is like show up and bear witness to someone else who needs their life to be witnessed exactly how it's unfolding in this moment. And the sacredness of that, there's a Peter Levine quote, who's a trauma therapist, and he says, he's a lot of other things too, but I don't have his Wikipedia page up in front of me. And he says, trauma is not what happens to us, but a lack of an empathetic response. And so, from that perspective, I think what we do as healers is always enough, and it never is enough. And I think like those contradictions, holding those at the same time, have been a really important part of my healing journey, and knowing that like this is a movement, like this is like we plant these seeds and we try to water them every day, but we might not see what we want in our lifetime, but we still have to show up and trust that like what we're doing each day is enough. And similarly, I think on my own personal healing journey, like holding the contradiction of like I didn't get what I needed, um that's a huge grief and loss that I'm still trying to work through, and I have to show up to parent myself in a different way every day. It's like who's gonna win? Like who's gonna, like the like child that's so like upset and longing and needing and like furious that I'm not being seen and getting what I need, or like this adult, this like connection to a higher power that can like help me no matter what. I don't know. They're both there all the time. And the other thing I want to say is like you said something about I think trusting yourself or empowering yourself, and I think that it's interesting, I think for folks who are listening to this too, of like thinking back on your own healing journey of the of what you did at the time was like the best you could do at the time, and it was probably like really resourceful and brilliant, like you talking about escaping into books, and I know you read a lot of like mythology, and like look how much that has sort of um created this foundation of how you see this world in like
Mhm.
big and poetic and beautiful ways. And I did a lot of theater, um and it was offered an escape, sure, but it also gave this real opportunity to be empathetic, which is not enough again, but it really helps.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, and be witnessed, right? For your talents, because you
Mm-hmm.
are, so delightful and talented, and
Yeah, to
I
be seen. You're right. You're totally right. I didn't want to
Mhm.
admit that, but you're right. Yeah, of course. Anyone who knows me who's listening to this is like,
Your
really?
your
You don't want to
Aries
be seen?
sun, yeah, in the 10th, yeah, to be seen, for who you really are, and I think that something you said I just wanna kinda speak to is, that I think ties in what I mentioned is that, when I started doing social justice work, uh a lot of the questions that elders put to me was like, how are you going to stay in this for the long haul? Like, how are you as an individual going to create a life for yourself where you're not going to burn out? Because the movement needs you. It doesn't need you for a day. It doesn't need you for a week. It doesn't need you for a semester. It needs you for a lifetime. And we have the life that we have today because people lived and died in conditions that they were working so hard to change and didn't actually see any change for a
Yeah.
long time.
Right.
But we know change is possible over, decades and sometimes centuries. And, for me, when there was a lot of rage, there was a lot of righteous indignation, there was a lot of, um, when I did a lot of legal support around street activism and First Amendment defense work, there was just like actual confrontations in the streets with police or counter protesters that were violent and scary and resulted in legal cases. And either being there witnessing it or like hearing about it and trying to help people find attorneys, like all of those things, some of the work that I did in the Bay Area with the National Lawyers Guild. And I couldn't really be well, honestly, and do that
Mm-hmm.
work. That work led me to need to escape in ways that were ultimately really harmful to me. And so when I did um, get serious about prioritizing my sobriety, I had to take a step back from doing activism in terms of like actual like grassroots community organizing. And that was really hard because it was a huge part of my identity. And it was something I deeply cared about and had given, a lot of my life to. And
Yeah.
but I had to really take a step back for almost 5 years. And
Wow.
I just couldn't go and show up and do what I had done because it was so hard for me to do that. Fully being present in the world. And
Yeah.
when I hear I'm part of the vortex healing lineage of energy healers, and one of my teachers, Lorraine Goldblum, who's really amazing, you know has this video she just released, and it's like, what does it take to heal? And she really describes our issues is like taking us out of being present. And
Oh my
like
God.
part of
Yeah.
the reason that we move towards healing is because it gives us the ability to be present with people. That like if I'm in so much pain and I'm like really preoccupied with what's going on in my life, like I can't show up as my best self. And
Hmm.
so I think that when you're talking about that really difficult kind of, for some people, for Geminis, no, but for some people, like the both and is easy, right? For some people,
Sure.
there is this like really powerful ability to to like say like this is not enough and this is enough, like,
Hmm.
and it was didn't work for me, and also I survived. And like, so like two things that are contradictory are true at once, and accepting that. But that's harder for other people. And so I'm I'm here for the folks that like struggle with like holding the both and of like how can something be enough and also feel like collectively there's a failure,
Yeah. Let's
and
bring a Gemini on.
yeah, there's so much wisdom of being able to
Yeah.
like hold it with both hands and to see the larger pattern, right? To like zoom out and be like, okay, there's some sort of sacred geometry that is
Hmm.
like unfolding here that I can't see in the moment. That we do see when we look like astrology gives us the ability to witness that over, hundreds of years and sometimes thousands. And so I think that for me, I'm interested in thinking about how there's a huge movement towards healing. Last year really exposed all of the failings of our system, all of the people that are at the front lines of being like vulnerable, who are just like white supremacist capitalist patriarchy is like, I'll just sacrifice your life because you're
Right.
disposable to the system. And thinking about how everything is so unflinchingly clear, and to look away and to not see really requires like a lot of effort. But there are people for whom they haven't had to, or they haven't been able to engage before in a healing process, and now it's a necessity for like various reasons, or now it's being
Yeah.
prioritized for, you know, various causes. There's different impetus for that, but I often think about how when people lived in for a long time in situations where there was like a village and there was a wise person, and that person was like the healer who knew botany and pharmacology, and Chiron is, you know, credited with like um founding pharmacology, and you know, teaching all of this like plant wisdom and medicine. And that person was the midwife, and that person, you
Right.
know, was an astrologer and a counselor. Every community needs that person. Every community needs resources. Like every community needs access to someone who can give them that perspective that they aren't able to access when they're in pain about how their life could change, or how this could one day be of service to other people. That like this is part
Yeah.
that like our painful initiations, you know, I have gotten so much out of the worst things that have ever happened to me. Would I choose to have them happen again? No. Like would I like trade what I got for the people I lost? Like yes. But like I have, you know, and I think that's a way of honoring our pain and our suffering, is by learning from it and getting the gifts and seeing what's there and what's being offered amidst all of the difficulty, and then making good use of that, right? Then taking that
Yeah.
like uncut gem and attempting to refine it in some way. And you know, one of the things I've been thinking about lately that I think is really beautiful in the Chiron myth is that we suffer, and you know, there's that idea that pain is mandatory and suffering is optional. But like most people, unless you are you know, born as like the Dalai Lama and you have like a really strong spiritual practice, are suffering because of the things that happen in their life that they don't want,
Sure.
or
Yep.
losing the things that they have that they're attached to. And but what the path of Chiron does is facilitate an experience where your suffering helps you to show up with empathy for other people. And then through that process, you gain other things. Like it's not just like we're these like, you know, selfless beings, or like, oh, I suffered and then I like show up and I help you, and then I just like, you know, go back to my cave and just like, you know, say my prayers and go to bed on a rock.
Right.
Like we get we get some, that is a past life.
I'll have
uh,
some herbs as a treat and
yeah, a
just
little
lie down
bitter
on
herbs
this
to
rock.
stimulate the liver. We need to detox. But like we get something out of it. We get love, we get friendship, we get community, we get for those of us that do it professionally, like we get a livelihood. And then there's this amazing thing that happens where we become less afraid of pain.
Yeah.
I think that is like the wizard level, you know, like I'm not really there yet. I'm still like a very pain averse person, but like there is this ability now when difficulty comes, and I think for most people, difficulty really came last year, that, you know, I don't know what this is leading me towards. And some things just, I want to say, like, some things are just awful and they're just wrong. And it just feels
Yeah.
like that forever. And there isn't a silver lining. And you can
Yeah.
try to like make good with it or around it, but like it doesn't actually feel like, oh, yeah, like some things are just pain and they just aren't, they're wrong. And I mean that in a lot of different ways. But there is that ability to like accept what happens as part of life. And I think one of the most profound things astrology has given me is this idea that a full life contains everything, like an actual, like
Mm,
a holistic, like if you show up and you ride the ride, which is what we're doing, you know, that you're going to go through everything and that it's all going to fall away. It's all temporary. This too shall pass, the good and the difficulty. And that at the end, you know, when you come to the end of your journey as the Fool and the tarot, that you will have had a full life and a complete life, and you have learned many lessons, you have developed many ways. And I really appreciate that, because I think especially for people indoctrinated in the United States culture, the idea of like the pursuit of happiness just leads you with an endless desire and craving that doesn't actually um it's not lasting and
yeah,
isn't ultimately satisfying on a spiritual level.
yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's probably where I want to leave it, but I am curious if you have any final thoughts or, you know, I therapeutic insights around this archetype and myth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to wrap this up too. I think that um I was just thinking when you were talking about how y- like so much of what the pushback against the US indoctrination is deemed radical, and how much people who are about a revolution are really talking about like leading with love, and leading and always coming back to love and showing up with love. And I think that that does kind of directly relate to Chiron, in the sense of if we're not doing our own work and if we're not invested in our own healing, um, then we might not believe that we can show up and be loved,
Mm.
even if we think we can show up and give love. And I think that's the wound, right? Like that's the first wound of Chiron. Um, and I think that that plays out in a lot of different ways. And I think from, I don't think there's one kind of therapeutic. I think that's basically the point of therapy is like, and the reason why there's so much need for therapy is that we don't know, we don't always trust that if we show up completely authentically, that it's going to be received and that it's going to be met with
Yeah.
validation and acceptance, and that we're going to find love there. And then there's a whole lot of books, encyclopedias written about the ways in which we maladapt to that, to try to substep that, and to try to control that, and to try to divert that. And um, you know, literally, I think the entire profession of psychology, oversimplified, could boil down to how are we trying to find love and how are we trying to protect ourselves from the fact that we might show up and not be met with love.
Mm.
um and I think that is, I think that's what I think that's part of why probably this was like really calling to us, is to have these conversations,
Yeah.
because um we can't move forward. um we can't move forward unless, and I don't know what I wanted to say there, but I think acknowledging that like we might be scared that we're unlovable is the first step, and then the rest of the journey is like, well, how do we want to show up for ourselves around that, and where are the ways in which we can be reminded that like we are loved.
Mm.
And that, I mean, we could have a different topic every time we meet to talk about that, but um, that's what's going to keep our livelihood going forever.
Well, I love that idea. Or I love that kind of ending on that pondering of, yeah, how how do we feel what are the places in us that feel unlovable, and what is it like to meet that place with love? That is, so much of the foundation of the healing journey. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. It's been so great to get to talk to you. If
I
folks
love you, bud.
I love you. And if folks want to learn more about astrology, my work, you can find me at lauracampagnastrology.com. I'm also on Instagram. And Maura, I know you teach at Simmons, so the lucky students there can try to find you in the course catalog. And do you have any other places you want to reference for folks? You have a really amazing blog where you write about all of these topics. So
Yeah, I have a blog that I update really sporadically and with no consistency whatsoever, and that is a thoroughly mediocre depression.com.
fabulous. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to our next talk.
Me too.